Welcome to the Evangelism Training Podcast. I'm Josh Minner. So excited to be joined today by my good friend Jordan Acer. Known Jordan for about 15 years, which out of all the guests we've had on the show, by far is the longest I've known any of them. And I've always appreciated Jordan. I first came to know him when I was a student at Bowling Green, and he was on staff with Crew at the time. And ever since then, I've always looked up to Jordan as almost like the older brother I never had. So, Jordan, what would you like to share about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm glad that you said my name correctly. So only my true friends use my name, Jordan Acer. It's Acer, looks like Acer. So you are in the inner circle, my friend. And yeah, just a little bit of background about myself. Obviously we met through Crew. I went to the Ohio State University. So my experience as an undergrad with Crew was not at BGSU, not at Bowling Green, where you attended, but was challenged to go, serve there and learn how to do ministry a little bit differently. So that shaped some of my mindset on evangelism, but it certainly started before that. And I think my background, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My parents both came down here to go to the Ohio State University as well and stuck around. It was a good place to raise a family. I have an older and younger brother. And we grew up going to church. I myself was into athletics and sports, and kind of saw everybody at church as I would call them nerdy Christians. I didn't get to know anybody in the youth group, and so I didn't really have close Christian friends, to be honest. I mean, that impacted the people you surround yourself, impact how you think and behave. Certainly at all walks of life, but in the middle school and high school years, they shape you. But even on this topic of evangelism, if you surround yourself by people who are doing evangelism and care about talking about Jesus, you're going to be increasing your heart for others in that sense. But certainly I was around the wrong crowd those seasons, and when I went to college, I had thought about it as a season where similar to what they say about Vegas, what stays in Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. My older brother gave me that advice. What happens in college stays in college, and it's 4 years. And that's not the case. You'll find that out, but consequences can carry through life. But thankfully, my first year in college, I had some guys who lovingly kept inviting me to a first year fellowship. They called it a Bible study. And they lived a floor above me in the dorm. And I had very little interest in joining them. I was joining a fraternity, doing that for social reasons. And they kept asking me if I wanted to go to the Bible study. I eventually gave in, thought there might be some cute girls there, and went. And Jeremy, I went once or twice. I wasn't, interested in staying there, long term. But Jeremy, one of my dearest friends now, kept inviting me, but he kept asking me beyond that invitation, how could he be praying for me? And just the power of prayer in my life was life-changing. I prayed a prayer of salvation, the sinner's prayer growing up, at least a dozen times. Every time it was offered, I raised my hand. It's like I knew I was a sinner. I was going to pray that prayer. But it wasn't until my first year in college, Jeremy asking me, someone who is becoming a friend of mine and a peer, asking with genuineness, how can I pray for you? Well, I kind of shoved him away and said, I don't need your prayer. And Jesus and I are close. We're cool, man. And certainly I was not following Jesus in that season of life. But when I needed prayer, I knew who to turn to. So part of my thoughts on evangelism is being available and accessible. And certainly, Jeremy was available and accessible to me when I needed him, when I needed that prayer. And in that season, it wasn't a day or a moment, but in that season, I started to understand Jesus not only as my Savior, but Lord of my life. And that lordship is really what changed the trajectory of who I am and whose I am and why I'm here. It gave me purpose beyond getting a good degree and a good career and all the things that you dream about as a young man. So I don't know if that's enough of a background.
Yeah, that's great.
I have a wife of 15 years. So you met us within our first year of marriage. We have 7 children and 1 on the way. So have been blessed in that. And that's a whole nother God story. And that I was done at having children at 4. But God got me over my selfishness and showed me that I am here on this earth to serve him and also serve my wife in an unselfish manner. So that was a season. Our largest age gap is between 4 and 5. And that's a whole nother story in itself, like I said. But happily married 15 years. Beautiful family. In the profession of wealth advising, just took the leap of faith and joined a partner at the beginning of this year in January. So that's been quite another faith journey. But our testimony is ongoing. It's not just what happened in the past, but what God is doing in our story and in our lives today. So figured I'd give you that background.
Yeah, I appreciate that and sharing about your testimony. I'd be curious, as almost like another testimony of kind of what's your, so you really got serious about faith in college, but as far as being concerned with evangelism and having a passion for that, what's kind of like your origin story with that?
Yeah, certainly. I think we're all impacted by evangelism, the Great Commission. So, somebody took the Bible literally and seriously and wanted to share the gospel with somebody else who then shared it eventually with us, hundreds and thousands of years later. So, that call to evangelism in the Great Commission at the end of Matthew is important. I think people are gifted in evangelism and extroverted. That certainly is my personality and maybe some of my giftings, but that's not a excuse not to be caring, care about others and want to talk to other people about Jesus. So just because somebody is an extrovert or an evangelist, if you look at that as a spiritual gift, doesn't exclude others from not being concerned about the eternal salvation of their fellow man. So I think when my life changed, I started seeing my purpose differently and started seeing people differently, and the way that, it's a beautiful thing. You start to see people less of how they can benefit you. And you start to see, and ask the question, how can I serve them? How can I love them? And caring more about their needs than your own. So there's a book early on that one of my mentors had me read. It's called The Celtic Way of Evangelism. I mean, what I remember and can recall back from that was that it was a way of life. It wasn't just something that you went out and did, on campus. You went, in open air evangelism and went to go, but it was a way of life and kind of woven throughout all of who you are. Not just an opportunity to kind of put it on my calendar for 1 hour a week to go out and do open air evangelism. So it was really a way of life to always be about Jesus, always desiring to and wanting to take the conversation to Jesus and eternal matters, because those are the things that really matter.
Interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of that book. Is it based on like history and like how the Celtic people evangelized when the gospel was new to that part of the world? Or
Absolutely. So yeah, it is tied into the historical time and setting, and kind of in looking back at what was happening, why was the gospel spreading, there in that area of the world at that time. So and taking that to the Western world and saying, how can we use some of this what we learned by looking back at history and apply it to our Western culture and today. So yeah, it's not something I've read recently. It's a long time ago.
Sure.
So I don't have all the details for you there, but yes, that's the premise of the book.
Interesting. So then, not necessarily from the book itself, but what are some insights that you feel like you've learned over the years about a lifestyle that's evangelistic, where you're really living that out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, somewhere early on in my faith and young faith, I thought I was going to be in ministry. Didn't know what that meant. I met with my childhood pastor, my parents' pastor at that time. Thought I was going to go get an MDiv, be as cool as Josh Benner, but I realized that that wasn't for me. Everybody's different, and I did not choose to go down that path. But in that wrestling, in that time, somebody had shared with me that we are all called to ministry. whether it's
Yeah.
full-time vocational ministry or, marketplace ministry or ministry in our families. Like, we're all called to ministry, and ministry is ministering to others, is creating disciples, and and discipleship making, and those who are then in turn sharing with other people. I mean, that idea of multiplication. But it was that season that kind of became more of a lifestyle, wherever God was going to take me. Actually, I was, after Crew, I had joined the financial services, and I thought I wanted to be a financial advisor. This was 2008, 2009. The market had crashed. I had a dinner with this advisor who was a missionary to China for 10 years. And then at this point in time, when I met him, he had been an advisor for 10 years. So he had gone through the two crashes at that point, and was in the midst of the second one. And so, just he shared about how much of a challenge it was to be an advisor in that season. But he gave me this advice, and it's so funny because I don't even remember his name. All my communications were internal when I was at Morgan Stanley. So I can't even look up this gentleman's name, but it was a referral from a friend. And we sat down for dinner, and he said, "I don't know you from Adam, but I'm going to give you this advice. If you prioritize three things, if you prioritize your relationship with God, your relationship with your spouse and family, and then you prioritize others above yourself, you're going to be successful wherever you go." So it was, God, wife and family, and then others, and yourself not in the list. I mean, when the selfishness creeps up, or these get out of order, the priorities get out of order, then you're going to be unsuccessful. His story, he was, again, a missionary in China and was pulled off the field. So because he prioritized others, the mission, never above God, but equal to God, was this: I'm called to, I'm sent by my church, people are funding this ministry, and it was equal to God. Well, what was below then his mission and others and the Chinese people was his family. So his priority, getting the priorities out of whack, ended up impacting his marriage and his family. And, he was ended up pulled off the field. And he said, "I failed those that I was trying to serve and love and care about by truly getting those things out of priority, and not understanding that I needed to love and serve my wife and my family first and foremost." So it was just, he said, again, he said multiple times, he said, if you prioritize those three things in that order: God, wife and family, and then others, you're going to be successful wherever you go. And I didn't become a financial advisor right after that. It was several years
Sure.
that, I'm kind of working in career, but it was just that idea of prioritization and the intentionality in relationships that kind of has impacted mine. So, I mean, I struggle with, because I have the gift of evangelism and desire to go do. Sometimes I struggle with, the family responsibilities, and certainly that has grown over the years with the number of children, and my understanding of that responsibility and that role has grown over the years too. And I'm hopefully, my prayerfully raising up children that fall in love with Jesus at a young age, and then can go
Yeah.
out and tell other people. So
Yeah. I appreciate that. And, I think it's interesting how easy it can be for Christians, or, across the whole spectrum of people who, might not be in any kind of vocational ministry versus a missionary versus the pastor, where you can really start to put, maybe not above God, but you can get your priorities out of whack and put things on an equal footing with God. And it's so interesting how easy I think it can be to get kind of misguided in uh, that pathway. Even that
yeah,
I
for
think
anybody.
takes intentionality. Yeah, for sure. Um, and you also touched on something I've heard you say before, and that I think is helpful. That everybody has a ministry, and I think maybe especially in our culture, I think a lot of times we think of other people. I don't want to say this. I feel like we give too much maybe responsibility or credit or to professionals in the church. I think it happens with youth ministry, where not all parents by any means, but too many parents overlook their own responsibilities of discipling and evangelizing their
Yeah.
own children, and think it's the youth pastor job. I think the youth pastor should be a complement to that, not because you only see that person once, maybe twice a week. Um, you know, but I don't think it's just with youth ministry. I think it's with all sorts of different activities of the church. You know, the only thinking that you do about the Bible in the course of a week is hopefully not just from the sermon, that
Yeah.
you hear on Sunday. Hopefully throughout the rest of the week, you're also reading and engaging with God's word. And, and so I think it can be easy to feel like different things of discipleship, evangelism, service, almost like that's not your job. Or maybe like a person can feel like they can wash their hands of it, like it's not their responsibility. And so I think that is helpful to keep in mind that everybody is called to minister. Every Christian has gifts. The Bible tells us that in multiple places, and those gifts are meant to be used to build up the kingdom and serve God. Uh, I've made the analogy before of like World War II. Even if you weren't in the military, like maybe you were too young or too old, like everybody in America was part of that effort. Like everybody had
Yep.
ways to serve and be part of it, big and small. And really that's how the church should be. That everybody who's a believer in the gospel has a way to serve and
There's
a
a
way to be
unity in that.
part of the body. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think we get the priorities messed up, or again, for too many, a lack of ownership of that's why you're here ultimately. If somebody's ever wondered why when we come to faith, why doesn't God just take us up to heaven immediately? Because there's work to do.
That's right. Amen to that. Yeah, there's work to be done. Yeah, I mean, you said something. I mean, so there's a reliance on the church or pastors or youth pastors. I mean, the responsibility falls on the parents, and we have to be intentional in our parenting. So this is a podcast about evangelism, but intentional fatherhood. Nobody else can replace that role. But we oftentimes, whether it's to the church or to the teachers, in our public school systems, we rely too heavily on. We always say, we usually get asked when people find out we have such a large family, are you Catholic or Mormon? Well, we're neither, but and people always follow up with, do you homeschool? They want to know how strange we really are. I think that's the question they're leaning into. But we don't homeschool. We public school our children, but we home disciple them. And there's some intentionality in that disciple making, whether it's part of the evangelism and follow up of a open air evangelism outreach, but there's an intentionality in that relational building, and even in those conversations, like you mentioned. I mean, just getting the conversation to something of meaning and purpose and eternal. You have to be intentional. You have to kind of lean into the person sitting across from it. You don't have an agenda. You're thinking of ways to get the conversation to the person of Jesus, because it's the most important conversation we can have. But it's asking questions. Your agenda is not to spout out truths about the Bible or about Jesus, or an apologetics kind of way. I mean, like, you want to know those things so you can genuinely answer questions. But it's never a debate, like, it shouldn't be a debate of this versus that, and I'm going to prove you right. If you care more about the person on the other side, there's somebody said this was a ministry that I was a part of years back, but they said there's kind of three things that really hold people up from truly embracing and knowing Jesus. It could be either volitional, or your will, you just don't want to. It could be emotional hang up. They've got some past hurts from the church, from a pastor, from a family member they see as hypocritical, that was saying that they're a Christian and has hurt them. So there's emotional hurts. Or intellectual. So, I mean, we want to be, ready to answer and know more about the person on the other side of that question they may be asking you, or the comment they make directed towards you, like looking through the comment and saying, what is that person, and what's going on in their life that I can ask good questions about, to let them kind of work through some of these issues. Truth is truth. And so it's gonna stand the test of time. It's gonna, even if I say something, wrong, there, the God's truth is truth, and so it's not something that I can shape or change. but helping them understand truth and asking good questions and helping them, revealing it to them through their own thought process. But again, thinking about the person on the other side, like how do I care more about them than I do about saying the right thing or not embarrassing myself in a conversation or the fear of man, right? I think you've said that before, Josh, yourself, and we can be fearful of what the person on the other side thinks of us, or especially if it's a close friend or family member. Like you don't want to hurt that relationship, and distance that. Really, I enjoy, watching the Buckeyes with this person, and I don't want to, them to not invite me to the next party they throw, the Buckeye watching party or something like, so I'm not going to bring up Jesus because, oh, you're that Jesus guy. I'm not going to invite you to the party. Like, do I care about them more than whatever it is? So.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a real concern. I feel like this springboards into something I was curious to ask you about. And I mentioned this before we started recording. Along with my friend Eric, who I had on the podcast a couple months ago, you two, of all the people that I know, I feel like are the two most natural at taking a conversation and suddenly you're talking about faith or about Jesus, but where it doesn't feel weird. And I gave the example. It's not like you're eating like chicken wings or pizza or watching a game, and out of the blue, like just some random spiritual question that has no relevance to what you've been talking about. Is that something that you feel like is a skill that you've developed? Is it something that kind of comes naturally for you?
Yeah,
How do
I
you
think
do it?
it starts first. Yeah, it starts first with a genuine love for Jesus. And
Sure.
so personally, if you are in love with something, whether it's Buckeye football, and I know I mentioned it a couple of times, but if you're in love with something, you're going to talk about it. So you're going to find ways to talk about it. You're going to get excited when you talk about it. So I think it starts with a genuine love for Jesus, and a thankfulness that He's chosen to use me, in this lifetime, and you're choosing to use someone as broken as me to further His glory. It's not about me, but yeah, it starts with quiet time, spending time with the Lord, prayer, certainly a lot of talking Jesus and thinking about others and eternal things. I mean, because I can get caught up with all kinds of things, throughout my day or my week and be distracted. But if I don't set my mind on things above, and prayerfully and regularly, then it's going to be my day is going to be off. And actually, so I'm going back to my story. The idea of Jesus being Lord of my life. Every day now, I start my day with a simple phrase, and I say, Jesus, you are Lord. How do I serve you today? That understanding, and I say it verbally out loud to myself. I want to, as I have breath every day, I want to hear myself say that. And it's that, position that I put myself in, understanding of the lordship of Jesus, not only just his, him being a savior, is where I get my instructions for the day, and pray, and then I start to praying for the day and the things that I know are on my calendar and the people that I'm going to be interacting with, and so I come, a lot of the preset meetings, the ones that are not kind of in the margins or random, I come into those conversations prayed up, and thinking about that other person and how do I have meaningful conversations with them, whether it's through work. I mean, talking about finances all day, but you can have meaningful conversations around purpose and life and things that are money is just a tool to achieve life's goals and purposes, and so how do I have those more meaningful conversations with clients and with others? It has to be intentional, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually leads into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, both with your current work and also previous places where you've worked over the years. How have you brought faith into the workplace?
Yeah.
That might have varied a little bit depending on the job and other factors.
Yeah, certainly.
But how
When
is
I've
that
worked
something
for
that you?
larger firms or worked for the Social Security Administration for a season, like finding some others you can align with. Again, we're the body of Christ, so those who you can be encouraged by, in the workplace, I think about one of my past coworkers. I used to read my Bible at lunch, and so they avoided me for months and months until we were almost forced to be on a project together. And and getting to know each other through that experience, he said, "Wow, you are, an okay person. You can carry conversation, and you seem to be pretty cool." So it's like, seeing that, reading my Bible at lunch, avoided, but the intentionality of certainly prayer that was impactful in my life, through Jeremy asking how he could be praying for me, and so in the workplace, asking, I've been, turned down only a very few times when asking, "How can I pray for you?" And I think the intentionality of asking those things, you have to follow up. I write it on note cards. Now I use an app called Echo Prayer, and keep kind of coworker prayer requests and like a little date next to it. And so, I try to follow up with those, and I honestly tell people, I say, I'll probably think about your prayer request, today, maybe tomorrow, this week. I'm going to jot it down, so I hopefully remind myself of it and be praying for you. But if it's still a prayer request a week from now, I'd love an update. How can I continue to be praying for you? Kind of putting it on them even to update me for, prayer requests, has been a helpful thing. In business and work, one thing that I've done, like as, managing people, I've taken like my binder or whatever it is that I'm presenting, or, especially in a one-on-one mentorship or kind of, to employee kind of relationship, I've taken that binder, their evaluation, whatever, gone through the business side of things, folded it up, set it to the side, and say, like, what's going on in your life? How's your family? And like, so it separates the business and personal, by just something as simple as closing the binder and sliding it up to the side of the desk. So, it's trying not to commingle those two things. And but looking for opportunities. I mean, it's intentionality in different ways, but prayer is certainly one of the things I think about. One of the most wonderful things that I've been a part of is a coworker named Marie. She used to be a spiritualist, is how I describe her, and she shared her story, publicly and openly, and so I have no problem sharing this on a podcast. But
Sure.
she would read really nice things out of this. She had this book on her desk that was like nice sayings from Gandhi or Mother Teresa or all these different kind of things, and Chinese proverbs or whatever. It was just this book of sayings, and she would read kind of one a day, or she'd read them when she needed them, or something felt like she needed them. And I asked her, what it was, and just in those curious questions. And then, as she, gave it to me, I got to flip through it, and there were some, biblical truths, or some proverbs from the scripture, or Mother Teresa. Certainly, you can, jump in, so using that as a conversation to get to Jesus, and then asking, again, how I could be praying for you, and learning more about her 3 children, and praying for her grandchildren, and some of the challenges that she had, and with her brother, and like, so it's like, as you kind of get to know somebody, that's just being intentional. I mean, I could easily have just done my job and kind of gone home and had other responsibilities at home, but getting to know people, asking good questions, leaning in, really truly caring about them. But yeah.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. It's a great story.
Yeah.
Why do you think evangelism is so? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, why do you think evangelism is so hard for so many Christians?
Oh man, I think one of the most challenges is it hasn't been taught. So it's not something that we either had a mentor relationship, or someone who has taught us evangelism. So that idea of discipleship and evangelism being a part of that, not just learning the word of God, but the ways of Jesus, and part of that is caring about others and evangelism. And so that's one thing. Personally, I think fear of man, fear of rejection. I kind of mentioned that before, but fear that we wouldn't have the right words to say, that we'd be embarrassed, or embarrass ourselves, or fear those relational ties, especially with family members. Like you're gonna see them again. It's sometimes easier
Sure.
to do evangelism in the inner city, or at the neighboring city, or somewhere else that I like, put my hands up and say, I'm not going to see that person ever again. It's like, or on the plane. I mean, I love kind of having a captive audience when I'm traveling. and try to catch them before they put their earbuds in, like introduce myself and try to, strike up a conversation. But in those kind of conversations where someone I likely won't see again, I always follow up with, do you know anybody else that truly believes this stuff? And is there anybody else in your life, an aunt, uncle,
Oh, wow.
grandma, or whatever that is following Jesus that truly believes this stuff? Because it puts them back in their world, not just this conversation we're having, it's meaningful, purposeful
Yeah,
conversation, but it puts them in their world, and you can give them your contact information. They don't know you. They just met you, whatever. They may trust
sure.
you some, and they had a pleasant conversation and a purposeful, meaningful conversation, but putting them back in their world, it's always fun to ask that because, they're like, oh, my grandma, she took me to church, or my sisters really got into this stuff. So they
Hmm.
then are putting them, like, they have a resource in their world if they have questions that follow up from your conversation. So
Yeah, that's a great thought. I appreciate that. I just, in my mind's eye, had this image of you when you're like 70 years old and retired, just flying every day from like Columbus to Cleveland, just for not even to go to Cleveland, but just for like evangelistic purposes.
you're stuck next to somebody
Um,
for that's not a long enough
yeah,
flight. Maybe a further away, going to New York City,
Minneapolis
or
is a
maybe
nice city.
flying down. Actually, it's funny. I have thought about, so retirement's not a thing in the Bible, right? But we talk
Sure.
about financial independence with people all the time, and wealth management, and what do you hope to achieve, once you reach financial independence, or call it retirement from a job. Um, but what are the importance of not, what's the John Piper book, don't waste your life, collecting
Yeah.
seashells on the seashore, and,
Yeah.
the ocean, like, that's the next phase of life. And I've thought about, my wife shakes her head at me. I mean, Jessica probably, just laugh, but what if we went down to a retirement community, we'll call it, Arizona or Florida or whatever, and just kind of put up went down there with another couple and just started, going door to door and asked people if they want to be a part of a Bible reading group, and just kind of multiplied that amongst these communities of people who are retired and, have a lot of time on their hands, but, kind of motivated and encouraged, that community, that age group, to be more missional, be more,
Yeah.
on mission, or uh, evangelism is part of their life, kind of training and teaching that group. But my wife is not going to be doing that with me, and we're not going to be doing that probably, but in later years. She thinks I'm crazy, but that was going through my mind, more recently. It was like, not retiring, but
Sure.
repurposing my time in that stage of
Yeah.
life.
Well, that's something I say, again, we have quite a few people at the church I pastor who are, a little bit youthfully challenged, older. But something I say is, there's no you and I were speaking earlier about how everyone has a ministry, a way to serve. And that's true for the rest of your life. It's not like you're 80 or 85 or 90 and you've been part of a church for 60 years and then you get to be done. No, death is retirement. Like if you still have breath in you, there's still ways to serve and to glorify God in your life. And um, if God didn't have a purpose for you in this world, he would bring you back. He would take you home, but he hasn't. So
Amen.
there's still work to do. Last thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the Great Commission earlier, obviously a essential passage to evangelism and discipleship. Are there any other passages that for you personally are really encouraging or convicting or helpful in your approach to evangelism?
Yeah. So, one of my life verses is 1 John 3:17. Says, he who has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet shuts off his compassion, how can God's love reside in him? I mean, my ultimate goal is to have God's love reside in me, and people to see God's love through me, and that's part of evangelism. But, certainly I think it's a call for everybody to compassion. We have the world's goods. If you're in this country, have food on the table, have resources, whether they're direct or through the government. I mean, there's just, there are people around the world who are well worse off. But
Yeah.
if you have the world's goods and sees a need, there's this part of that passage that says, like, the seeing of the need. So we have to lean into that because Jesus said the needy will always be with us. So there's always going to be people in need, whether you're here or there, around the world. But it's that seeing and having that heart of compassion and not shutting off the compassion. So there's this act of seeing, and it's not just the physical need, but I think in evangelism you're seeing a spiritual need. Like what is this person behind the question they're asking, or behind this interaction? Like, who is this person that you're there and speaking to? So seeing the needs, and not shutting off my compassion, saying I'm too busy to have this conversation, or I don't have the margin. I mean, a big thing, is really having margin in your schedule, in your time. I mean, so you're going to be more successful in evangelism and connecting with people and seeing a need and filling a need, or not shutting off from compassion to that need, when you have margin in your day. And I can get caught up in the busyness. You've probably heard it before, but busy, being under Satan's yoke. It's like if you're too busy, that's one way that Satan uses, so people can't be, having conversations about Jesus, that you're too busy for that. I can't help that person that's on the side of the road and needs their tire fixed. I've got a meeting to get to, or I've got this, so building margin, whether that's, we talk about financial margin, but that time margin, in your life or in your schedule and your week is important as well. I mean, and so being intentional in either scheduling that out or whatnot. But yeah, that First John 3:17 is not a direct call to evangelism, but it's a call to see the need and then not shutting off my compassion. And so it can be a physical need and meeting a physical need, but also seeing that the spiritual need that we all have. So.
Yeah. Well, once again, I appreciate you taking time today and sharing. And I think that this is such a encouraging perspective, and love you, bro. I appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, I love you too. I thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I certainly don't have an MDiv or a doctor in front of my name, but it's a passion and a heart calling, I think, for everybody. So the intentionality of this conversation, and I thank you for putting this podcast together. Interviewing people, getting this topic of evangelism. We haven't been called home yet. We've got work yet to do. So I appreciate you kind of spearheading that and pushing that forward for your audience.